Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, good morning, depending on where you're joining from. I'm very happy to be chairing today's session. My name is Shaheen Pishbin. I'm a junior research fellow at the Queen's College, the University of Oxford, and a researcher in Persian literature and Persianate studies. Today, I'm very happy to be chairing as part of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, the latest lecture in Manuscripts in Interfaith Contexts series. Today's speaker is Dr. Jaimee Comstock-Skipp, who holds a BA from the University of California, Berkeley in Islamic civilizations and Arabic and Persian languages, a first MA from Williams College graduate program in the history of art in Massachusetts, and a second MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, where she studied Persian language book arts, predominantly from Iran. She completed her PhD at Leiden University, writing a dissertation on illustrated epic and biographical manuscripts from Central Asia in the early modern period, and diplomatic exchanges between courts across the Turco-Persianate sphere. She is now completing a Leverhulme early career fellowship at the University of Oxford's Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. I'm delighted to be chairing her talk today, which is a slightly modified title of Caucasian Persianization, the Man in the Panther Skin Manuscript in the Bodleian Library. Jaimee, I hand the floor over to you and look forward to a good discussion afterwards.
Thank you so very much, Shaheen. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you in attendance for your support, and especially Negar Habibi, who was very instrumental in offering some feedback and special citations. What makes an illustration a Persian miniature? What qualities inhere in this type of artwork? A range of objects from different times and places, united by their medium, if not always the language of their accompanying text, have been subsumed under this heading without explaining what makes them Persian. Each of the term's two components has proven to be problematic. But let's start with the more concrete and tangible second entity, as opposed to the elusive essence of the first. Oh, just trying to, switch to that. The term miniature refers to a tradition originally connected to Europe that emphasizes size rather than technique. So this miniature term refers to an object based on how minium, or red sulfide of lead, seen here, was used in European manuscripts during the Middle Ages. This mineral gave the name to a whole activity of manuscript painting, as well as forming the Italian verb miniare, which means to illuminate or decorate a text, to make a miniature. Only later, some sources say it was in the 1580s to be precise, did the substance of minium come to be confused with the word minimum. With this slippage, small dimensions were assumed, despite the production of some very quite large-scale manuscripts that we see here. I returned these bigatures myself, and this is actually a facsimile. But we see that it means that you outline first and then fill in the accompanying lines with color. And then after this, you then add details for varying levels of refinement. These points refer to a process of production and location in a book. But we now come to the second term in Persian miniature. And so this is the compound. Going to the first section of my talk, I'm going to explore how the manuscript illustrations to a Georgian language manuscript called the Vepkhistqaosani, or The Man in the Panther Skin, by Shota Rustaveli, is in the Bodleian Library. And so I'm going to explore why and how these look Persian and connect to Iran. The term Persian can refer to the language of a manuscript containing illustrations or a geographic attribution where Persian was spoken or appreciated, but more often it functions as an elusive and cultural stylistic evocation deployed without proper explanation. The Georgian manuscript permits a targeted investigation into specific artistic and political connections between Iran and Georgia in the late 16th through the 17th century. Future studies pinpointing similar cultural imbrication elsewhere in the early modern period, such as the intersection of Azerbaijan and Iran, would deepen an understanding of the broader Persianization and Turkicization of the Caucasus that is still contested today. But in this present discussion, only the Georgian region will be examined vis-à-vis Iran. I will explore the directionality of motif transfer, and establishing this, I will call into question what length of time might separate a visual source from its derivation. And so, spoiler alert, this is going to be quite a challenging thing to propose. Whereas other scholars have posited an overly broad 17th century provenance to the Bodleian manuscript's illustrations, here it will be pinpointed that the illustrations to this manuscript of the man in the panther skin were added smack dab in the middle of the 17th century, so around 1650. They reflect a familiarity with artistic conventions and developments in Safavid Isfahan, synthesized with elements from local workshops in or near Tbilisi. These latter elements were added during a unique period of intensified cultural relations, wherein artisans hailing from Georgia contributed to works on paper in Iran, just as visual components from Iran permeated manuscript production in Georgia. The object emboldens us to critique the term Persian that has been used to describe this manuscript from the Caucasus, written out in the Georgian language with illustrations stylistically indebted to visual formulae from Iran. If you want to get into the object's Persianness, or, quoting the scholar Tamar Lekveshvili, its uncritical transplantation of the Iranian traditions of miniature painting, we have to be specific and link inherent figural and compositional commonalities to specimens taken as source materials. Visual vestiges shared between Iran and Georgia, specific to the manuscript and in general, elucidate and confirm cultural exchanges in particular. So we'll be doing this, so instead, to problematize this term Persian, that is not a given expression. And so this talk is going to be a case study in artistic influence and diffusion between a presumed original source and later assimilation and deployment elsewhere. It is undeniable that within Iran's fluctuating borders between the 11th through the 16th centuries, there was an extraordinary burst of Persian poetry and literature, followed by illustrated manuscript production and distribution that codified certain compositions, scenes, and figural types. Visual as well as literary forms, and the makers of them, circulated across a vast geographic expanse and derived inspiration from within and beyond Iran's present and historical borders. Broader Georgian-Iranian relations extend across several millennia, but there evolved intensified interactions and integrations in the Safavid period. So here, the Safavid domain is in pink, and this built upon earlier legacies. But during the rule of the Safavid Shah Abbas I, through the rest of the 17th century, in which the Georgian manuscript is posited to have been painted, cultural boundaries were exceptionally porous. Caught between the Ottomans and the Safavids, between the 15th and the 18th centuries, the two eastern kingdoms of Kartli and Kakheti would officially be vassals to the Safavids in the first half of the 17th century. They came under the Iranian cultural sphere of influence with intermittent suzerainty in the second half. Artistic, sartorial, architectural, and linguistic motifs associated with Safavid Iran mixed with local Georgian elements that were made either through first-hand exposure and employment in Isfahan or through intermediary sources that transferred to Tbilisi and the environs. And so I'll point out here that Tbilisi is right above the map area that is in mustard yellow, reading the Kingdom of Kartli and Kakheti. Cultural assimilation and population displacement are evident in the Man in the Panther Skin manuscript in the Bodleian Library. The art historian slash Orientalist Basil Gray initially examined illustrated versions of the title in 1951. Upon the library purchasing this Wardrop manuscript, that's the collection from which it's taken, so it was purchased from a certain Bernard Eckstein in 1949. Basil Gray, in this article, asserts that the illustrations are found across versions of the libraries of Tbilisi and Oxford, and these are always in a Persian style, and he clarifies this as being a flat style with a Persian tendency towards repetitive emphasis and conceptual arrangement. Regarding the distinctiveness of the Wardrop manuscript, he declares the style of its miniatures to be, and I quote, strongly Persian, but they nonetheless differ both in composition and coloring from contemporary Persian work, end quote. This present study expands and updates Gray's preliminary examination by including Michael Baxendall's important deconstruction of the term influence in art history. So art historians always use influence in quotation marks, if not gasp at its usage. I adapt Baxendall's critique to nuance our perception of power relations presumed to diffuse from an assumed cultural hegemon, in this case Iran, to an assumed periphery, here the Caucasus, specifically Georgia. Paraphrasing Baxendall, if one says that X, or the Iranian Safavid dynasty, influenced the iconography of Y, in this model, Eastern Georgia, it does seem that one is saying that X did something to Y, rather than that Y did something to X. But in the consideration of good pictures and painters, the second is always the more lively reality. In other words, rather than repeating that Iranian art influenced or was imitated by the Georgian illustrators of the Bodleian Manuscript, it is more interesting to examine the ways in which the paintings accompanying the text attest to cultural encounters and the combination, perpetuation, and innovation of a tradition based on internal and external factors. So I'm going to focus on Baxendall's Y, the Georgia in general, and the illustrations of the Bodleian manuscript in particular. But whereas Baxendall's formula would claim that a Safavid Iranian X cannot act on a Georgian Y in the same way that a Georgian Y acts on the Safavid Iranian X, my argument actually demonstrates that these divisions are intrinsically unstable in the 17th century illustrations on which we are focusing. So in sum, with regard to the 17th century painted arts, X acts upon Y just as Y acts upon X. Let me here provide some background on the manuscript under scrutiny. The Man in the Panther's Skin has been characterized as a Georgian model of the European chivalry romance. And so I should state that scholars often compare it, or the poet Rustaveli, to the Iranian poet Ferdowsi, seen here. Ferdowsi is credited with establishing modern Persian as a language, and as an aside, he's also the founder of Iranian nationalism. But the Man in the Panther's Skin has been likened to Ferdowsi for, reasons that I disagree with. However, both texts, this certain manuscript of Ferdowsi, as well as the Man in the Panther's Skin of Rustaveli, both of them include warriors wearing animal skins. Ferdowsi's warrior on the right is Rustam. He's always in a tiger skin. Rustaveli's hero Tariel is identifiable in manuscripts wearing a leopard skin. But more significant is the ways in which the two works have come to encapsulate the ethos of a nation and a people. Georgia and Iran have since used these two texts to be sources of proverbs, aphorisms, and idioms in their respective cultural spheres by people who have never even read the original works. And so this tendency to link Rustaveli to Ferdowsi, or that they are mutual analogues, is more a result of modern national agendas than historical fact. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh was harnessed by the Iranian state in the age of nationalism in the 19th century as a response to European interest in the work. And this is a bit anachronistic to the work's original era of production and later copying in the early modern period. So in other words, Ferdowsi did not envision his opus as Iran's national epic, as it is commonly labeled today. So too was Rustaveli's Panther Skin co-opted for nationalizing purposes in the Soviet period, rather than this was after a lengthy critical neglect in centuries intervening. So citing a period Soviet account from 1937, there was celebrated in Georgia the happy birthplace of the great Stalin, together with the fraternal nations of our great union, the Rustaveli Jubilee. So this marked a literary resurgence, with Rustaveli joining the ranks of other national poets in the republics, such as Nezami in Azerbaijan, Rudaki in Tajikistan, and rediscovered folk epics elsewhere in the Soviet sphere. However, rather than Ferdowsi, I agree more with the scholars who liken Rustaveli to Nezami. And so Nezami, as we see here, was born and lived in Ganja. We see this on the map, and it's indeed closer to Tbilisi, to Rustaveli's domain. Nezami's works and perhaps Georgian translations of his original Persian poetry came out around the same time. So some scholars have suggested, well, maybe Nezami and Rustaveli, there might have been some connection there. And indeed, it's only 200 kilometers apart. But Rustaveli served Queen Tamar, whose reign witnessed the largest expanse of the Georgian kingdom's domains to become the major Christian-administered territory of the East. So this is immediately prior to the Mongol invasions in 1221. The latter, Nezami, was never really, he never secured courtly patronage, and he resided in a region that would be overseen by the Seljuks. So we actually see the Seljuks here. So this is to say that while Georgia was expanding in power at the time The Man in the Panther Skin was composed, Nezami's homeland was marred by political uncertainty during the shift from caliphate to Seljuk authority in the Caucasus. So this is just a little bit of historical context. I want to here just explain some other characters from Nezami that have parallels to Rustaveli's text. So individual stories within Nezami's poetry feature paired lovers. So does Rustaveli's Vepkhistqaosani, or This Man in the Panther Skin, in which beauty is equated with loftier qualities than mere aesthetics and carnality. They encompass the sacred as well. Nezami's text here, Layli and Majnun, is a romance that has several direct parallels to The Man in the Panther Skin. There's an Arabian setting in the theater of enacting events between rival groups. The male protagonist even faints upon first sighting his female lover-to-be, and the same male protagonist loses his female as she is sworn to another, and he then goes and has to try to find his way, but becomes a bit of a hermit, lives with animals, and goes through all sorts of trials and tribulations. So both in Europe and Asia, poetry was passing through a remarkable change at the time that these texts were composed. And this is a change in tone as well as in spirit. So whereas before, the popular stories were more about the pursuit of glory and honor, later there was a transfusion of romantic love in these, in which heroes did everything for some mistress whom they adored with passion, even if they had never seen her. The Man in the Panther Skin uses ethnic and geographic terms such as Arabian, Indian, and Khwarezmian. And this final term, Khwarezmian, actually implies Persian. These do not really correspond to actual groups, however, and instead they refer to particular sets of values. So in the text, Arabian refers to a person who can foresee the consequences of his actions, while an Indian cannot. Characters in the story mainly come from these two realms and have these qualities, but lest we think that Indians are unfairly targeted, the main protagonist of the story is indeed Tariel, who is the man in the leopard skin, and he indeed is from India. He's both a good fighter and brave of heart, and so as opposed to this, the Persian or Iranian quality is associated with the literary work itself and not a certain character. So Rustaveli's appropriation of this Persianness or Iranianness has been debated, and literary scholars suggest that Rustaveli is not literally translating from the Persian, but instead he's making a Georgian contribution to a Persian canon of literature. What makes it Persian or Iranian in derivation is its treatment of kingship. And so kings have kind of a quasi-divine position as God's representative. And there's another character who is Khwarezmian, and this is interpreted as culturally Persian, so kind of geopolitically linked to the Khwarezm Shahid Empire. which actually encompasses Iran and Central Asia. But at the time that the work was composed, Rustaveli was factoring in politics and geography in the world that he himself resided. And so this Persian as a descriptor is, to Rustaveli, a vague cultural and political designation, and this would continue across the centuries. So we now come to some specific paintings inserted into the Bodleian manuscript. Let's see. And let's do some comparisons to some of the Iranian, I don't want to say sources, but some Iranian comparative materials. So here we see a wall painting in the Chehel Sutun, the Iranian capital in Isfahan. It's of Shah Abbas, here in gold on the right. He has a fantastic mustache. And so this was painted in the mid-17th century, but it actually depicts some earlier events that were taking place in the Safavid court. So earlier in this century, earlier on in the late 1500s, early 1600s, Shah Abbas had implemented a Ghilman system. So this Ghilman system involved recruiting Caucasian slave soldiers. And Georgians were one of the peoples providing the most converts to Islam. This is within Iran, from the 16th century until the end of the Safavid era. So Georgian converts to Shiite Islam involved certain converts writing whole treatises refuting Christian tenets in their native Georgian language. And so these would then be translated back into Persian. Thousands of Circassian, Georgian, Armenian slave soldiers joined the civil administration and the military to rival the earlier Qizilbash tribe, so an earlier model of Safid governance that was more associated with the founder of the Safid dynasty in the previous century. So one of these, the new Ghilman, oops, sorry, let me go back. One of these new administrators was actually a Kartli-born administrator, and he actually became one of Shah Abbas's closest courtiers. And so he converted to Islam, he governed from Isfahan, and so he was overseeing Isfahan before it then was selected as the capital. So I turn here to some artisans of Georgian descent, a bit of a shameless plug in my blog post co-authored with Asim Said on the left. So in addition to political intermingling, we're starting to see how artists originally born in Georgia would serve in Royal Safavid workshops. And so the late 16th century painter of Georgian descent named Siavash or Siavush lived all of his life in the Royal Safavid court and probably dabbled in commercial copies before his death. But he worked in important centers within Iran, such as Mashhad, Qazvin, Isfahan, and Shiraz. Serving 4 Iranian shahs between the 1570s and 1590s, Siavush represents more than any other known painter of the late 16th century a court artist of the most traditional type. And so one can add the service of his brother, Farukh Beg, on the right, who after serving Safid patrons migrated to India in the mid-16th century to work in Mughal and Deccan centers of manuscript production. Still another possible, another painter possibly of Georgian descent is this Ali Qoli Jabadar, who commissioned or who contributed to commission specimens of the Safavids. Given that the state of the arts in Iran are more or less explained, I'm turning now to Georgia and the Bodleian manuscript illustrated there. If my supposition of around 1650 is correct for the visuals, then these were added well after Georgia was divided into 2 spheres of influence to be administered by Ottoman and Safavid powers. So it was kind of a toss-up between the Ottomans in Anatolia and the Safavids in Iran. The Georgian manuscript lacks a colophon, meaning it doesn't have the final page in the manuscript that might otherwise give some good information about the provenance, the process of completion, the patron, the year in which it was finished. We know that it was in the possession of a noble Georgian family in Tbilisi up until the 19th century. And based on the illustrations, there is reason to believe that it was completed and remained in the eastern part of Georgia, in Kartli, which was visually and geographically closer to Safid Isfahan than Ottoman Istanbul. General Islamic and particular Safavid influence penetrated the provinces of Kartli and Kakheti, and first reached Georgian nobility in the late 16th century and increased in the 17th as Safavid contacts and exchanges became more pronounced during the reign of Shah Abbas I. So it's in this period that Irani prototypes fueled local Georgian manuscript productions with what various scholars term Iranicizing miniatures added to them. They clarify that this Iranian artistic influence does not imply domination, but is rather a desire to follow a fashion introduced from abroad. So prior to the proposed date of the Bodleian Manuscripts illustration, again, so pre-1650, there were artistic exchanges during the Safavid Shah Tahmasp's military campaigns in Georgia. So these were in the century prior. So all this is to say military contacts, cultural contacts, artistic contacts have been taking place in the 1500s, well into 1600s, 1700s. Scholars have noted that the Bodleian manuscript's adherence to prototypes from Isfahan, and some have supposed that these were added in the middle of the 16th century or even earlier. But these details really attest to a date much later in the following century. So whereas scholars have thought that these illustrations here in the manuscript in the Bodleian Library seem to evoke, middle of the 1500s, they really are more in line with what is taking place in the later century, in the following century, mid-1600s. We even see how the Bodleian manuscript's adherence to prototypes from Isfahan even kind of copy some of this architectural design in the painting on the left, the manuscript painting. We see this kind of element, that kind of, what is it, almost Muqarnas-like elements above the arches. And here, oh, let me go back. Let's see. With this architecture, one might question how long a style associated with one center takes to transfer to another. This is indeed an open question, as is whether the artists responsible for the Bodleian manuscript's illustrations had personally trained in Safavid workshops, such as Isfahan, or whether these forms and figures transferred through circulating materials for Georgian artists to then copy. So either the individuals themselves went to Iran to learn traits and techniques and then returned back to Georgia. Perhaps certain papers and folios and manuscripts indeed were brought over and they could have consulted them themselves there. Within the Bodleian manuscript illustrations, there is not much use of gold or precious pigments. And so this suggests to me that they're a little bit dilute, not very vibrant, so they might not be for a real courtier. But they are in the same style, and they reflect talented draftsmanship with pleasing and dynamic compositions. And so these paintings here depict a fortress before and after an attack. The painting on the left, in which Patman sees Nestan Darajan and gives her a letter as she sits atop a turret, this is kind of a quiet interlude before the drama of an ensuing attack. And so if we really kind of look at the composition, we see that this second painting is really typical of siege scenes in illustrated Persian manuscripts. So we see troops on horseback barreling into, an open gate, usually going over a moat. In this case, good heavens, there's a bit of fire to try and blockade them. But it does seem to be that the artists of the Georgian manuscript are really drawing on the cultural sphere, drawing on what is in their everyday lived experience, perhaps Narikala, or this particular fortress here, the Akhaltsikhe Castle. I noticed this kind of gold dome, which kind of echoes that red dome on the left in the painting, the kind of crenellated tops of the stone fortress. So despite these undeniable local influences, local elements, the Bodleian manuscript's illustrations can be contextualized within the broader Persification, if you will, the Iranification of Georgia in the 17th century. Again, our Orientalist scholar, Basil Gray, comments on Iran's religious and sartorial dominance, specifically between 1615 1694, so within the decades when Eastern Georgia was politically under Safavid control. Focusing on the manuscript's elegantly garbed figures and subsidiary characters moving through the scenes and compositions, we see how they wear some elements associated with other illustrations across the Turco-Persianate world at the turn of the 16th and 17th centuries. So it actually seems more like the illustrations in the Bodleian Library manuscript are a bit retardataire, meaning they're passé. They're kind of outdated because they seem to evoke more trends in later illustrations to Turco-Persianate manuscripts produced elsewhere. Here we see a colorful kalpak headwear, and compare those to a Persian language Shahnameh, actually produced in Samarkand, present-day Uzbekistan. Or here, note the figure, the dancing figure on the left in the background of pink. This seems to evoke these kind of figures associated with the Indian continent, subcontinent in later manuscripts produced. But perhaps if this manuscript on the right is from 1617, I'm associating the Georgian manuscript with a few decades later. So again, there seems to be a little bit of a lag, if you will. Here we see some of the thigh-high boots that seem to be connected to Safavid Isfahan. Again, just more parallels to give you a sense of what the manuscript might be picking up on, evoking. In the absence of colophon, so in the absence of this final page that would give some better contextualization and information about the scribal and painting practices carried out to complete illustrated Georgian manuscripts, chronology does indeed get a bit confused. So it's very difficult to determine when the Georgian manuscripts might have been finished. We can look at other Georgian works. So we see here on the right, Yoseb Zedekhaniani manuscript. This is a Georgian language translation of Yusuf and Zulekha, or Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, if you will. And so if we compare these two manuscripts, the illustration on the left, which is from the Iranian Safavid realm, has a bit better provenance. This is connected to Isfahan around 1590. Here, in the Georgian romance on the right, a man pulls Yusuf or Joseph from the well and looks just like a depiction of Shah Abbas with a courtier painted in Isfahan around 1625. Or here, in another illustrated Man in the Panther Skin manuscript on the right, this is likely made later in the 17th century based on comparative compositions in a Safavid composition on the left. And so we know that this leftmost illustration from the Safavid sphere is carried out by the painter Moin Mosavir in Isfahan around 1680. Scholars have dated all of the Georgian examples I have shown you, the Yusuf and Zulekha translation, this Man in the Panther Skin. Scholars have used a very broad chronological provenance of 17th century, but I think it would be much more helpful if we could gauge a little bit more precisely when all the illustrations were made. And you have to do this by kind of setting them out and looking at them in relation to each other. I do want to stress, though, that the comparative Iranian Safavid paintings that I've shown you as comparisons, these can be used as benchmarks to determine dates of production for the Georgian materials, but this is simply because there are more of them. There are more of the Safavid manuscript paintings. And they also have provenances that are a bit more secure than the Georgian objects. But I would like to stress that the Safavid works on paper assist with provenancing the Georgian materials and do not necessarily prove that they were made first. So, turning from contemporaneous Safavid book arts to wall paintings, numerous visual parallels exist between the adornment of the Royal Safavid Chehel Sutun Palace in Isfahan with the Bodleian manuscript. So on the screen is a large-scale painting featuring Shah Abbas receiving Vali Muhammad Khan of Transoxiana. And so this is an event which took place in 1621, but the painting dates to around 1647, according to Susam Babai. Isolating a detail in the lower right of the wall painting, we see a swooning figure in purple with red boots, with an attendant offering a cup to help revive the sprawled man. Similarly, in the Georgian manuscript, the character Tariel is also in lavender robes and red boots, and he has fainted in the presence of his beloved Nestan Darejan. Or should I say the Persian word for matchless. So her name is actually derived from the Persian Nist Andarin Jahan. So here in the manuscript painting, the attendant in yellow is standing over him and is pouring a faded ewer of water to revive him. So whoever was responsible for the Georgian manuscript's illustrations could have been familiar with these wall paintings. And I just, as a little aside, since there's ongoing destruction to cultural heritage in Iran, the Chehel Sutun Palace was targeted in an attack last month. But let's not dwell on that. I want to show you another wall painting from the Chehel Sutun that hangs directly opposite the one that we just analyzed. So this is in Isfahan. It is of a very festive banquet, and Shah Abbas's grandson and his successor to the throne, Shah Abbas II, held this gathering in 1646, perhaps 1647, when this certain Nasr Muhammad sought refuge in Esfahan before returning to Transoxiana. So if this celebration was held in 1647, it does indeed seem to be the case that the paint could still have been wet on the wall when he departed and crossed the Oxus. I want to point out some elements here that links the wall painting to the book illustrations. We see dainty footwear by men, worn by men and women in the Georgian manuscript, as in the Iranian palatial interior. Please note the high heels that are very colorful and popular later in the decades of the 17th century, even into the 18th. And so these are worn by the men on the far side of the wall painting. We see the counterpart below. Notice that the musicians as well seem to have a similar compositional structure. The woman holding the daf above, she seems to echo the painted manuscript on down below. But in the wall painting, this player of the kamanche, the black and white spiked fiddle, so in the painted wall above, this musician wears a distinctive garment, this distinctive robe. And it's going to be the topic to discuss next, these kind of sartorial elements that link the two spheres. But again, we're going to come back to this query of how does inspiration, how do the ideas for these compositions flow? Are they flowing from the wall to the page or the page to the wall? From Iran to Georgia or from Georgia to Iran? So let's further fine-tune our circa 1650 date to the manuscript illustrations. So to me, the detail that really clinches a mid-17th century period of production for the Georgian manuscript illustrations is this inclusion of a fur-trimmed gold robe. So this is called a khalat or a qaba. So it either has long or short sleeves, and also these elements of the turban in the manuscript paintings as well seem to be connected to the Isfahan, the Safavid Isfahani realm. These types of gold-embroidered khalats were bestowed as gifts to courtiers and visiting dignitaries as favors from the Safavid Shah in the 17th through the 18th centuries. So visitors to the Safavid court in Isfahan in the 1650s described these royal outer garments of gold and silver brocade and silk. And so a Georgian general in Safavid service, this Imam Qoli Khan, he served Shah Abbas I with great loyalty and died in 1632. And we see him here in a manuscript painted decades after his demise. But we see that the shortened cut of the gold robe reflects sartorial trends that are current to when the manuscript was produced and illustrated, so not necessarily in his lifetime. Outer gold robes with flared lower portions, as well as their sleeves, get subsequently shorter as the 17th century progresses, and they can be a means to deduce chronology through fashion. Imam Qoli Khan, depicted here, wears a gold vest that barely falls below his waist, and this affirms how men's robes and coats were becoming progressively shorter as the century wore on. The most striking change was in the cut of the robe. which was worn fitted over the torso, stiffened at the hips and cuffs with quilting, with flaring bell-shaped skirts. And so we're encountering here variations of this golden robe lined in fur. And so this manuscript, this album painting, is dated to around late 1660s. And so gauging from the hem and the cut of the garments, it does indeed seem that this can be used to affix a chronological date to this production. We also see this gold robe here on certain courtiers. This is also of a Safavid Shah, Shah Suleiman, inspecting herds. But let's go back to Shah Suleiman. Shah Suleiman was actually the penultimate Safavid ruler, so he was second to the end of the Safavid dynasty. And he seemed to enjoy albums to be made for him. So albums are comprised of single-page paintings gathered together. And so in this album folio, we see that he's inspecting these herds, but let's focus in on a very rather dour, clean-shaven figure with striped rosy turban. I suspect he might be a palace eunuch. And so this individual wears this fur-lined golden robe in these paintings. But in this illustration, we see that actually two figures on the left also deserve attention. They have identifying names written above their heads. And so the inscription of the man in green is not so legible and may read Shah Qoli Khan, written out in Georgian. The man in purple is designated as Shah Nazar Khan, which was a name given to him by the Safavid Shah following his conversion to Islam. So he was more commonly known as King Archil II, and it was actually his father, King Vakhtang V, so these are Georgian royalty, who had also adopted Islam, but had earlier rebelled against Safavid authority. So this is just to show that, there's conflicting relations between Safavids and Georgians at this time, but there are political alliances and peace treaties as well. But turning to other, oh, sorry, and there's a lovely close-up of these dignified gentlemen. Turning to other materials, visual and textile, within Georgia, the other Georgians are depicted wearing these same robes. And so we see these gold embroidered fabrics here. Safavid robes could be politicized objects, as donning them signified allegiance to the Shah, although they could be given as a genuine gesture of favor and acknowledge goodwill. We see here Robert Shirley, who was an English traveler to Shah Abbas's court. So these gifted robes are mentioned by Rustaveli himself in The Man in the Panther Skin text. And so in the story, a character, this King Parsadan, had to give his own cloak as a sign of respect towards Tariel, but this had the aim of expressing greater respect. And so the king offered him a choice. The king he orders Tariel to select an item of clothing. And so this kind of gets at the robe's ambiguity. The robe either heralds subservience or fashionability is at play. This is true in the portrait of King Vakhtang's wife, the courtly queen Mariam Dadiani. So this is in actually the cathedral that holds her tomb. She's here with her son, Prince Otia, who has similar floral patterned fabric. And indeed, the patterning, the foliage on that really seems to be connected to our, I'll call him the dour, clean-shaven figure, not the eunuch. On the one hand, these garments could have been gifts from the Safavid Shah, or on the other, the fabric was imported from Iran and then sewn together, all together in Georgia. And so if you accept that these robes could be an acknowledgement of vassalage, that's one interpretation. But these robes could also be derived from textiles that were produced in Iran for wealthy buyers in Georgia, so less a politicized reading. The robes over time became common household goods, which suggests sartorial assimilation. And so it's worth noting that European travelers and missionaries passing through Iran and the Caucasus, such as Jean de Chardin, they would often come back to England or France with these very garments. So it seems like these were either sewn directly in Georgia or Iran, but depends on how you want to interpret them. But we do see quite a few of them in the Georgian manuscript. And so they do seem to be kind of this intermediate length, not quite as short as the later 17th century versions, but more connected to the middle century. So although I conjecture that the Georgian manuscript in the Bodleian Library may have been painted by an individual or individuals who had themselves been in the Safavid capital, but then returned to Georgia to pursue their career, they could also have rendered Safavid sartorial forms by remaining in Georgia throughout their entire lives, since we know that these garments, these fabrics, were plentiful and easily acquired within Georgia. I've posited a mid-17th century period of production for the Bodleian manuscript's illustrations with some intentional ambiguity on either side. This is so that they slightly postdate the wall paintings of the Chehel Sutun from 1647, and so this suggests that inspiration flowed from the walls of the court to the Georgian page. But I acknowledge a counter-argument. Given the many artisans and administrators of Georgian descent operating in the Safavid court at Isfahan, indicated by a nisba, or a suffix in their names, gorgi, this could also indicate that the Georgian manuscript may have been painted earlier, so prior to 1647, prior to the Chehel Sutun wall painting. Might the artists of the Bodleian manuscript have worked on these smaller works painted on paper first, in Georgia, then have ventured south to find employment in Isfahan? Rather than compositional and figural elements transferring from a wall in the Isfahan palace to a book's page in Georgia, who can fully deny that the movement did not actually take place in reverse? So I'm going to conclude by returning to the opening discussion of Persian miniature. Our Georgian manuscript of The Man in the Panther Skin has been one such specimen of Persian miniaturization. Past scholarship has emphasized its formal qualities and affinities to larger workshops and these associated with courtly capitals, such as Safavid Isfahan. But the similarities are indeed striking, and it is natural to assume a larger court dictated tastes and styles, and these then trickled down to smaller production sites and vassal states. That is, after all, my conjecture, or one possible conjecture, for the Georgian manuscript. I call this hegemonic flow from big to little. Whereas at the start of this paper, I stated that this is kind of seemingly self-evident, going from more dominant, powerful to smaller locale, suggesting that the Georgian makers of the Bodleian manuscript imitated or were perhaps influenced by Iranian artists and arts. What I hope is now clear, or has since become complicated, is that in the specific era of the manuscript's illustrations, I would suggest that there was a unique cultural intermingling taking place that brought Iranian and Georgian politics and arts together in ways that had never before been as integrated. Some of the very Iranian artists working in Safavid workshops contributing to the arts of Iran themselves had hailed from Georgia. So what we must then acknowledge is that an Iranian or Persian style is thus comprised of entangled and diverse talent coming together. It is a sum of the parts, and practitioners from both inside and outside who are brought together into the Iranian fold nourish and indeed are nurtured by this tradition. One cannot dismiss, discount, or rule out the power of the individual constituents and the possibility for manuscript production centers, such as that of Tbilisi, located outside of a major metropole, Isfahan, to be drivers and instigators of original forms and compositions. So these then could transfer and become the dominant iconography of a nucleus attracting artistic production from all over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jaimee, for that very, very interesting, very rich, and very thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed it and have a lot of thoughts. So I really appreciated how you situated the Georgian world within this kind of broader Persianate world, which we've been hearing a lot about sort of in recent decades of scholarship, and also the sort of fine detective work you've done to establish a sort of intertextuality, if that's maybe a useful word, and sort of visual quotation between Georgian paintings and Safavid paintings and iconography. Um, so I have a couple of questions about this kind of idea of influence and how problematic the term Persian is, and then also a question about the text, the poem, and how it relates to the paintings. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about this term Persian painting. As far as I understand it, this is a not a term. Persian painters never described the tradition to which they belonged as the Persian miniature tradition, right? This is a European, maybe 19th century um, sort of etic coinage. So I wonder, if you find words like Persianate or Turco-Persianate, a way around this, and also to some extent whether you see the kind of use of this term Persian by early Islamic art historians as somehow prefiguring and anticipating this kind of Persianate turn, not as a way to center a kind of Persian ethnicity, but as a way to center sort of Persian textual traditions, which are at the root of a kind of shared cultural sphere, um, which you're obviously very much engaged with. Um, and Secondly, if I can ask, about this poem, which I knew very little about and have learned a lot thanks to your wonderful kind of explication of it. So you said it was written in, I think, sort of the 12th century. It strikes me it has a lot in common with the other kind of Persian long narrative poems that would be written around that time. Yes, Nezami, but also, poems before that, like Visur Ramin, which, you may have seen Cameron Cross's recent book about that, Love at a Crux. And I wonder if that kind of context of both vernacularization, but also the the global medieval spread, as I think Cameron Cross describes it, of this kind of long narrative poem, is a context in which you can situate the man in the panther skin as a way of, I don't know how much time you spent with the poem itself. Not only because I'm interested in the poem, but I think, how the poem relates to the Persian literary tradition, as it were, might tell you something important about how the painting also relates to um, the Persian miniature painting tradition.
I like the term Turco-Persianate. And the reason why is because the same types, the same artisans, the same look of manuscript painting features in Turkic language texts as they do in Persian language texts. And even within the Safavid dynasty, within my beloved Abulkharid, Shaybanid Uzbek dynasty, um, they are patrons of both Turkic literature and Persian literature to be illustrated. And so I think it's much more helpful to use that term, Turco-Persianate arts of the book, as opposed to Persian painting, which, let's see, is that? So 1912 is when this Frederick Martin publishes this book, but I guess he phrases it more as the arts of what, Iran, Turkey, and India. But there's a great schematic called Persian painting, which is 1967, Basil William Robinson, in his, I think it's in the descriptive catalog. Or no, that's 1958, but it's really 1950s that this term starts to be used, Persian painting, and this is kind of connected to a big exhibition in 1931 of what was it, the exhibition at the Royal Academy, Burlington House, in which this idea of, I don't want to say co-opting, but the new Pahlavi dynasty were big stakeholders in this exhibition, and they wanted things to be categorized, classified as Persian, the Iranian state in early 1930s. And so that then spawned all these publications, Arthur Upham Pope, coining, taking this term Persian art, what comprising of Persianness, Iranianness. This then gets redeployed, and a lot of things, whether it's Central Asian, Caucasian, a lot of things gets thrown under the heading of Persian or Iranian. But now I think we should disentangle a bit and better stipulate.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's super, super interesting. And I think, yeah, scholars of the Persianate world have a lot to benefit from your more sort of art historical analysis of these terms, how they relate to style and questions of influence and questions of, dealing with cultural and religious difference, which is obviously a sort of key feature of this cultural sphere, the different polity. I think once again we can thank Jaimee, Dr. Comstock-Skipp for this wonderful, wonderful talk and presentation, and the Oxford Interfaith Forum for hosting this wonderful event, and hope to see you at future events. Thank you very
Thank you so
much.
much. Yeah, thank you, Shaheen, and thank you so much for attending, all of you in the audience. Thank you.